This week in Brisbane, new flood mapping that could affect thousands more properties across the city. Conflict in City Hall over transparency following changes to Queensland's local government laws, and a first look inside QPAC's brand new Glasshouse theatre as it opens its doors to the public. Adam here with the Brisbane Update, where we take a look at some of the things happening across Brisbane City this week. Let's start with the flooding issue. One of the big Brisbane stories this week is the release of updated flood mapping, with reports suggesting thousands more properties could now be identified as having some level of flood risk. For many people, that kind of update can be a big deal because flood mapping is not just an abstract planning exercise. It can affect how people think about buying, selling, renovating, insuring, or even just living in a property long term. And in a city like Brisbane, that's a big deal. Flooding is not some distant or theoretical issue here. It's part of the reality of living in this city. And for a lot of residents, the memories of 2011 and 2022 are still very fresh. So when flood maps change, it tends to get people's attention very quickly. Alongside that, there are also reports of a surge in interest in flood resilience upgrades, with more homeowners looking at ways to better protect their properties from future events. That can mean a range of things depending on the type of home and the level of risk involved. For some, it's about practical retrofits like using more water-resistant materials downstairs, raising electrical systems, improving drainage, or redesigning lower levels so they can cope better if water does get in. For others, it may simply be about understanding what their property can realistically withstand and what changes are worth making before the next major event rather than after it. It also highlights a broader challenge for Brisbane. As the city grows and as more attention is paid to resilience and adaptation, there's an increasing need to balance housing demand, affordability, and urban growth with the physical risks that come with the city's geography. So this is one of those stories that sits at the intersection of planning, insurance, cost of living, and long-term livability. It's one that is likely to keep coming up, especially as updated modelling and more detailed local flood information continues to emerge. Staying with issues that could affect how Brisbane is run, there's also been a political conflict this week over the local government's Empowering Councils legislation that passed through the Queensland Parliament. The state government says the changes are about streamlining council processes, reducing red tape and improving governance. But in Brisbane, the council opposition says some of the changes could reduce transparency and make it harder for non-LNP councillors to scrutinise decisions being made by the administration. According to the Brisbane Labor opposition, late amendments would limit access to information and documents discussed outside formal council meetings, reduce opposition access to information on citywide projects, and create a new 10-year right to information exemption for key committee documents. Those are the main reasons they've argued Brisbane could become a much more secretive council under the new arrangements. Now, supporters of the legislation would argue that this is about cleaner governance arrangements and more efficient administration, not secrecy. But from an accountability point of view, the core question is a simple one. How much access should opposition councillors, and for that matter the public, have to information about decisions affecting the city? That's the practical significance of this story for us as Brisbane residents. Because even when legislation sounds dry or technical, it can shape how easily major decisions can be scrutinised, challenged, or even just properly understood. So while this may sound like a niche City Hall process story at first glance, it actually goes to a bigger issue: transparency around how Brisbane is governed. On a very different note, Brisbane has been named a much more livable city than Sydney and Melbourne, at least according to Brisbane City Council's Better Brisbane Index. According to Council, 92% of Brisbane residents surveyed rated their overall quality of life highly, and the city scored well ahead of Sydney and Melbourne on several livability measures in the survey material released this week. Now, as always with council-run perception surveys, it's worth remembering these kinds of indexes are not the same thing as a hard measure of affordability or service performance, but they are still useful for showing how some people say they feel about living here. And the broad picture council is pushing is that despite all the pressures Brisbane is facing around housing, cost of living, congestion and growth, a large majority of residents still see the city as a very good place to live, work and raise a family. That probably won't surprise a lot of people. Brisbane still has some very real advantages when it comes to climate, outdoor lifestyle, access to parks and river spaces, and the fact that, for all its frustrations, it still feels more manageable than some larger capitals in a lot of people's eyes. At the same time, the survey also reportedly picked up concerns about housing affordability, population growth, and cost of living, which again probably won't surprise anyone who's been paying attention. So in a way, the index reflects the contradiction that Brisbane is dealing with at the moment. A lot of people genuinely like living here, but that doesn't mean they think everything is going smoothly. It can be both a highly livable city and a city under increasing strain. Now to one of the more visually appealing Brisbane stories this week, the opening of the new Glasshouse Theatre at QPAC. Thousands of Queenslanders got a first look at the new venue through a free community day, with tours, performances and public access to the new theatre spaces. This is a significant addition to Brisbane's cultural infrastructure. The new theatre adds around 1,500 seats to QPAC and helps make it the largest performing arts centre under one roof in Australia, according to the government's material released around the opening. And beyond the numbers, it's also one of those projects that says something about where Brisbane sees itself heading. There's been a lot of talk in recent years about Brisbane growing up as a city, not just in population terms, but in terms of identity, confidence, and capacity to host major events and performances. Projects like this are a part of that story. The state government is obviously framing it in the context of the lead up to 2032 and the city's broader cultural and visitor appeal, but regardless of the politics around that, this is a major new venue and it will be interesting to see how well it is embraced over time. The first productions scheduled for the venue also suggest they are aiming high, with Queensland Ballet's Messa de Requiem, Sting's The Last Ship, and The Drover's Wife, the opera, all part of the early program from what has been announced. So this is a big one for Brisbane's arts scene and also a strong visual story for the week. There are also a couple of development and city-shaping stories worth keeping an eye on. One is the approval for Fortis's revised Crest and Walker project at Newstead, which is another sign that developers are still pushing ahead with premium inner-city apartment projects in the right locations, even while broader concerns remain around apartment feasibility and construction costs. That's an important point in the current Brisbane housing conversation. The city can have a shortage of new housing overall, while still seeing certain high-end or particularly well-positioned projects move forward. In other words, the market is not frozen across the board, but it is increasingly selective. And that selectiveness is significant because it affects what kind of housing actually gets built, where it gets built, and who it's realistically aimed at. There's also another proposed tower project in Fortitude Valley that helps reinforce the point that inner city change is continuing, even if it's happening unevenly and often amid debates around scale, character, and infrastructure. So while the headline housing conversation this week has been about the feasibility crunch for many apartment projects, at the local Brisbane level we're still seeing the city's inner suburbs evolve in quite visible ways. One example of the kind of high-end apartment development that is still moving ahead in Brisbane has emerged this week in St Lucia, on one of Brisbane's remaining riverfront sites. Developer Greater has unveiled plans for a project called Silk, after purchasing a riverfront block on Sanford Street for about $17 million. The proposal outlines a 15-storey residential tower containing just 22 apartments. Rather than aiming for high density, the development is positioned as a boutique project with a mix of 2- and 3-bedroom apartments that would occupy either half or full floors of the building. Planning documents say the tower is designed to take advantage of the site's northern outlook toward the Brisbane River and the CBD. The design includes landscaped communal areas at ground level, along with a gym and outdoor garden space, while the rooftop would feature amenities such as pools, dining areas, and outdoor relaxation spaces. Architecturally, the design draws inspiration from the movement of water along the river, with curved forms and sculptural elements intended to soften the visual bulk of the building. The proposal also incorporates sandstone elements in the facade, a material commonly associated with St Lucia, alongside vertical landscaping along the street frontage. Projects like this also highlight a broader trend currently emerging in Brisbane's apartment market. Even while some developments struggle to proceed because of construction costs, premium projects in high-value locations, particularly along the river, are still moving forward. Another city story this week is a practical one for drivers. Brisbane City Council has announced that PayStay will join Cellopark as a second app-based parking payment provider from 17th of March. On one level, that sounds like a pretty small story, but it's actually a useful example of the way council services are steadily shifting further into app-based and digital systems. Council says more than half of the city's parking transactions are already made through an app, and a significant number of paid spaces are now app-only. The stated argument for adding a second provider is that it gives motorists more choice and improves reliability. And from Council's point of view, the longer-term backdrop here is also the cost of maintaining physical parking meters, which remains substantial. So this is one of those stories that is not dramatic, but is still relevant to everyday life in Brisbane, especially for people who regularly park in the inner city or suburban centres. One smaller but still interesting Brisbane item is the wider question of how the city continues to balance growth, amenity and movement. Whether you're talking about new development proposals, updated flood mapping, app-based parking, or the ongoing debate around transparency and governance, there's a common thread running through a lot of Brisbane stories right now. The city is growing, changing, and becoming more complex to manage. And that means more pressure on the systems that shape everyday life: housing, transport, planning, public information, and resilience. So even though the stories this week are quite varied, they all point in the same general direction. Brisbane is continuing to evolve quickly, and the challenge is not just growing, but growing well. Those are some of the key things happening across Brisbane this week. And as always, let me know in the comments which of these stories matters most to you and what you think Brisbane is getting right or getting wrong as the city changes. If you'd like to stay up to date with what's happening across Greater Brisbane without the spin, make sure you're subscribed. There's a couple of other LGA updates here and the Greater Brisbane overview and a full playlist which has all the updates. See you there.